Thank you very much. Today is July 18th. This is the Beach Advisory Committee meeting for July. We have two microphones up here, but they're just for the recording, not for hearing us. So if you can't hear us, make a motion. My name's Paul Hogan. I'm the current chair. Can you introduce ourselves?
I'm Pam Sikansky, relatively new member and vice chair.
I'm Carol Sherman and I'm secretary.
I'm Barry Youngle.
John Dykstra, I represent the Board of Selectmen.
Paul Hayes is no chair today.
And we have Fred Stafford out here who's running our Zoom room if anybody shows up. Thank you. And Tom is stuck in traffic on his way back from New York. So he may join us in a little while. I wanted to congratulate John. John used to be on this committee as the town's elected representative. The people in town get one person on this committee, and John used to serve in that role and has been fabulous in many projects. And now he's on the Board of Selectmen, so he's now their rep. So it's nice to have one of our own on the Board of Selectmen.
Although you've got one who knows nothing about how the board works, so that's a disadvantage. Right. I'm the newbie.
Maybe. Well, congratulations. Thank you. And thanks to Bill Dugan for arranging our use of the firehouse tonight. And then we can go right to approval of the minutes, which were sent around. Mm-hmm. Any discussion, comments, changes? If not, I'll take a motion to pass them.
Motion to pass the minutes.
A second?
Second.
Barry? Thank you, Pam. All in favor? Raise your hands. Since we're all here, we can see each other. Everybody, that was unanimous. Thank you.
The one abstention, you should probably say, because I wasn't.
You weren't here. Thank you. John abstained. Oh, you weren't even, I was thinking you were here. No, you were gone from the committee by then. Okay, next on our agenda is, are there any comments from the public that are not on the agenda? If you want to speak, you should raise your hand, and then I guess come up and maybe go to the end. We'll move a microphone over there so that we can get you on the audio. Any questions, comments from the room? Seeing none, I will go right to our reports. We have 3 active committees: communications, natural resources, and traffic safety. Barry, you want anything to report? We just, by the way, we got a bunch of new members last month, so we reorganized, took our committee assignments. Some of the committees have met, some have not met, so we probably will not have a lot to report from the committees at this point, since they're new.
I'll just give you a status for the benefit of everyone and those in the room. Since the last meeting at which myself and Tom Pereira, who's supposed to be sitting here, the two of us are heading up the Traffic and Safety Committee. We had 2 volunteers last year, Art LeMay and Tom Adler, living here at the beach. They have both, I was in touch with both of them in the last week or so. They both volunteered again to join the committee, so there will be 4 of us, and I'm very excited just having the continuity from sort of one year to the next. And Tom in particular has a background in traffic safety as an engineer. He's worked with the company for years doing that, so there's a lot of expertise there. I did send around to our committee sort of a recap of where we are, but the goal will be in the next couple of weeks for the 4 of us. We'll just try to make sure people are here for schedules. We'll get together, and we've got a list to sort of follow up on last year, as well as start to incorporate ideas for this coming year. I'll also say, just before I hand the floor back to Paul, anyone in the community that has ideas for traffic safety, what we can do along either the west end or towards the public beach or the back roads, Community House Road, etc., we're all ears. So any idea will be certainly entertained, and we're going to discuss it. We also have on the agenda, we're going to be meeting with the police chief to bounce around sort of where we are and what the next steps he sees that we can do, and set up some speed reports, et cetera, that had been done back in 2014, so it's time to update those.
Yeah, he did some speed reports on Beechwood and New Bedford Road.
Yep.
And I guess on Beechwood, where everybody said there was a lot of speeding, they have some matrix by how many cars go faster than the speed limit, and it turned out it was much, much lower than people expected or thought. I forget what the New Bedford Road, then we got the town to put in speed bumps, which I think has helped on New Bedford. Thank you.
Can I make a suggestion since you asked on Beechwood, New Bedford here? How about an additional bump closer up? We live right off of Winter Harbor here, and people are coming off and coming down about 50 miles an hour very often. And it's like pretty surprising. A lot of kids riding bikes there.
So the question from the back of the room from, what was your name? Sorry?
Bill Hopkins.
Hi, Bill. Was simply a third speed bump closer to Winter Harbor because the other speed bumps are much closer to the beach, and there's a nice little hill, and people seem to pick up speed there.
Well, it takes them a while to slow down. They come off, I think, off of Route 9.
Yeah.
Doing 55 or 60.
Yeah.
It takes,
Come around the corner and boom.
and it's nice and straight, and I think one there to remind them would be a good thing.
Mark?
May I suggest maybe that we wait for the report of those speed metering, and then based on that, we'll decide to go further.
Yeah. What they'll meet with the chief is to decide where, if he can do them this summer. We need them done, obviously, before Labor Day.
Yes.
What capability does he have and where can he do them, based upon concerns. Okay. Carol usually gives us
I do.
a little,
I have a clever report.
so let's go with Carol.
Want me to do it?
Yep.
Okay. This data I have is from the Maine Audubon Society. And according to the Maine Audubon Society, several beaches have fledged their final chicks or are almost ready to fly. They have counted 130 fledged birds across our beaches. And fledged means that they're able to fly. 14 nests are still in incubation, and they are still tracking 90 chicks. The least terns lost some of their nests to the recent high tides, but the colonies are doing well overall, and they're starting to see some fledgers. Last year, the state of Maine had 125 pairs and fledged 313 chicks. Last year, Goose Rock's Beach had 9 pairs, this is of piping plovers, 12 nest attempts, and 22 chicks. Goose Rock's Beach as of today. We have 12 paired piping plovers. We have 5 active nests. Nest attempts was 29. Chicks are 11, fledged are 6, so that's a total of 17. Nest hatched is 6. And why did we lose so many nests? 12 were predated, which means that they were, an animal got them. And it'd be, according to Maine Audubon, they track it by the tracks around the nests, and they're mostly skunk and fox tracks. They didn't see a lot of dog or cat, which is,
Good.
I'm pleased. 4 were washed out when we got the high tide, 1 was abandoned, and 1 was unknown. This year, the town has hired Kaylee Porter, who was a volunteer coordinator. And she would like to have people who would like to monitor the piping plovers, and she's going to be sending out information. She wasn't able to come tonight, but if there's anybody here that would be like to be a monitor for the piping plovers, I'll be happy to take your name and give that information to her. Let's see, the other news. All of the nests are sitting tight, and we watched a few adults trade off incubating duties. This is from Amanda, who writes these funny stories. Anyway, a brood of 4 on the west end is getting so big, they're all sticking close together. All of the fledgers are flying and mingling with the adults from the nest. The Dyke Road brood, and why would any bird wanted to make a nest at Dyke Road. I have no idea. It has 4 chicks, and it's still hanging tight to the patch closest to the western end. And they did not see any chicks or adults at the far east end, but they were hoping that they were hiding in the dune bath. And that's all I have.
Thank you, Carol, very much. Thanks for all your efforts on behalf of the plovers and least terns. The only other thing from Natural Resources, I asked John if he would just, he and John Crowder, who's back there, have been working on water quality issues with the town for a couple of years. And this year, we participate in the Maine Healthy Beaches program, and we test 4 sites along the beach, and then we've done some tests off the beach because of high counts. This year, well, John will explain what's happening differently this year and what the goal is. Can I ask you to do that?
Yeah, we're currently sampling 17 sites throughout the watershed, and we have probably 10 or 11 sites in saltwater, and there's either 6 to 7, depends if there's one of them that might have some salt influence. But the intent is to try to get a handle on what amount of the the indicator bacteria is coming from the freshwater source into the salt marsh, and how much of it might be incubating or growing in the salt marsh, contributing to the amount that then flushes out onto the beach. So we have basically a 3-tier system here. We've got our freshwater feeds that drain road systems and yards and dog fecal waste and potential sewer, as well as all the other natural and farmland, as well as all of the other natural sources, potential sources of bacteria. And that's washing through our streams, through Tyler Brook and through Smith Brook, and the Batson as it comes down through, as well as the Little River. And those, I think, are the main inputs. So that's the upper system in the watershed, and then the marsh itself provides fertile ground for this bacteria to incubate and to grow. And then we monitor along the beaches where we're all swimming, and the intent of the entire program is to notify folks when the indicator bacteria get above the EPA threshold of 104, which is colony forming units per 100 milliliters. But it's the measurement that they use for the concentration of the bacteria. The thing that we're most aware of is that the bacteria we measure, Enterococci, is in itself not that particularly dangerous to humans. I mean, a huge concentration would be. But this bacteria has been identified because it's easy to measure. It has been used as an indicator bacteria for other pathogens that are dangerous. So studies were done in California where they knew they had dangerous pathogens from sewage, and they measured the water and looked at what was the fecal indicator bacteria level that would warn you of having a high level of pathogen, and that's the 104. So what's to note is that we're not measuring the dangerous pathogen, rather we're measuring a surrogate. And what we want to know is how much of the dangerous pathogen is really associated with the surrogates that we're measuring here at Goose Rocks. And to do that, we've initiated, I guess it's really started since 2018, a DNA study, where we're looking at another bug that's associated with all these other two. It's called Bacteroides, that has a signature, a DNA signature, if it comes from a human source. And those are really the ones we're interested in. Because of interspecies barrier, the feces of other animals, not healthy, but they're nowhere near as dangerous as what human fecal bacteria are. So that's really what we're after, and that's what EPA is essentially after as well. That's what is the least safe for our swimming. So we are doing monitoring of DNA. We're sampling twice a week in the upper watershed, every week along the beach. And those samples are sent to UNH. And then together at the end of the season, a few of us will gather and we'll look to see which 4 samples from all of those collected, from the 10 collected in the back marsh area, we will do the DNA analysis on. We can hold these. They're called filtered and frozen, right? F&F. So you can take the water, filter it, freeze it, and analyze the DNA later. So we'll be choosing those, analyzing them. That's what we've done for the past 4 years to try to get a handle on how much human is associated with the high entero that we measure at the beach. Boy, that's a long-winded thing. So that's basically what I don't know bugs. That's really true, what we're trying to do. So
So, John, is that to say that hopefully at the end of this season, we would at least have a recommendation or some sort, or is it
No.
more ongoing?
No, it's ongoing. And the recommendation, the 104 is set, and this is the EPA standard. If we have any hope, my dream, and I think they're truly rose-colored glasses, folks have said I'm quixotic on this, is to convince, or at least to be able to demonstrate to EPA that if your beach is behind a large salt marsh, that 104 is really not a good number. That bacteria most likely is multiplying in that salt marsh, raising the levels when the dangerous pathogens are not necessarily present. And so to try to get a different level, because right now we are an impaired beach. We are the dirtiest beach in Maine.
The rivers,
The two ends.
the two
The
ends.
two ends. But we missed it by this much, getting the beach, and we'll see what this year's going to do. So,
Just to follow that up a little, like,
Yeah.
would we be in a position where you and your group would be able to say, the DNA is showing that it's animal as opposed to human? That even though we haven't changed the EPA position,
Right.
Right.
it would give certainly myself, and I know a lot of people, some sort of relief.
we're certainly going to be in a position to share that data. I think to state that, oh, gee, it's safe, I think would be dangerous all the way around.
No, but at least you.
So we can certainly share the data and let people be informed on that piece and make their own decision. Yeah.
And part of the goal, if I understand it correctly from the meeting I was in the fall, was that there are DEP grants available.
Yes.
And you have to study the entire watershed in order to make yourself eligible for the DEP money, which is a multi-year, you get a small grant to do a really good study, and then if there is depending upon what you find, if there is a remediation that's possible, you apply for another grant. It's like a 2 or 3 step
Right.
process.
Right.
And the testing we had done until this summer didn't go far enough up the watershed to really merit grant application status.
Correct. We didn't have the fresh water on dissolved oxygen and pH particularly that are important as a baseline just to show what's there before you can apply for the grant. And I should really ask John if I've misstated something or anything in there. Thank you.
Pam, our guest speaker, any thoughts, comments? No. Okay.
Anyone else, any questions?
I guess I do have one quick comment, and that is that the Biddeford Pool is going through this exact same thing right now, and the University of New England is working with the city of Biddeford to do what you all are doing, trying to identify the source and looking to see if it's human or animal, et cetera, et cetera. And Robbie Fecto at the city of Biddeford may be somebody that you might want to talk to.
Absolutely.
Because they're right up the road and they're doing the same thing, and it may be helpful just to compare data and see if you can maybe even get, I know now UNE is doing the DNA analysis in-house.
You are?
Really?
Save some money, I believe. So it just might be worth chatting.
Well, that's great. No, we're driving down to New Hampshire. You're a heck of a lot closer.
Yeah,
We
and
don't really have a lab set up to do that on a regular basis like they do at the University of New Hampshire, but there are faculty there who are microbiologists who have decided they're going to take this on as a project with the Biddeford Pool being right in our own backyard.
Sure.
And UNE's kind of under the microscope for this as well, so, they have a vested interest in finding out what's going on there, so.
Thank you.
I would recommend that you tap.
What might be fun is, we're sending these samples, maybe we could also send one to UNE, and that way you'd have a comparison to what one lab is seeing and the other's seeing. So maybe,
yeah, that would be helpful to you guys,
I
too.
should talk to Robbie, FECL, F-E-C-L?
So, F-E-C-T-E-A-U.
He's on staff?
Yes, if you go to the City of Biddeford website, you'll see this contact.
FECL. Thank you, cool.
Thank you. Anything, communications to report, Fred and Pam? Okay, I didn't think so. So we won't have a communication report. Does anybody on the committee have anything for new business that they want to bring up? We do have a guest speaker, so we sort of go fast during the summertime.
I do have something to bring up, and that was following up on the last meeting.
Yeah.
Where a resident was talking about Dinghy Point and all of the different things being left there. I noticed, I live right near there, so right at the Bel Air entrance, yesterday I noticed there were 2 boats that are right at the end of the Bel Air entrance and not at Dinghy Point, and they have 3 tags on them. And one was from July 7th. So starting July 7th to now, there are 3 warning tags. And so what good is it if these are tagged and there's no enforcement of anything? And in addition to that, there's a bunch of kayaks right along where it's roped off and all that. And they have boogie boards and chairs and things stored there with them and all that. So my question is, how are we supposed to enforce these things? Because it's only going to get worse. Because I don't think we have any authority to do anything ourselves, right? I mean,
We, us?
yeah, we have.
No.
No.
No, the process, and I sent a note, Fred sent me this information this afternoon with some pictures, and I sent it to the chief, and I don't know who, the chief's staff is doing their job by putting the warning signs on, but I don't know if it's the highway department or someone from public safety who removes the gear. I thought from years ago it was highway, public works, but I will follow up on that and let the committee know, let everybody know. The other ones that, shouldn't be there, the other junk, the only thing that's allowed there are boats. So if
Boats and kayaks, right?
Yes, a kayak is a boat. So if there are other, if there's other gear there, it should be reported to to either public safety person you see or call that non-emergency number so they go and tag it, and then we'll.
Okay.
But it shouldn't, obviously, if there are 3 warnings, by the time the second warning comes, it should be gone, I would think. Okay, thank you. Anything else? If not, let me see. Our next meeting, going toward the end of our agenda, our next meeting is Monday, August 15th. It will also be here. I wanted to thank John Crowder before we adjourn for doing an article for our little newsletter on sand dollars. Thank you very much. Much appreciated. I wanted to thank Audrey Lakin for doing our Facebook page, which she posts the water quality information as well as anything that anyone else gives to her. And I also noticed that this Saturday is the Goose Rocks Beach Association's 75th anniversary party. I think you can go on their website and buy a ticket. $25, gets you dinner, bring your own, I think. And if there is nothing else, we will adjourn the meeting and then have our guest speaker. Motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Second? That was John.
Second.
and Barry. Thank you very much. All in favor of adjourning? Should we just wait till Tom gets here from New Jersey, or from New York, before we adjourn? Okay, so Pam, where are you going to talk from?
Wherever it works with the projector. So I think I'm
So we should move out from the center here, so the screen is clear. Pam is a professor at UNE. Her topic tonight is the importance and protection of our local salt marshes. Pam teaches environmental studies at UNE. She teaches courses in conservation, wetland ecology, restoration, ecological monitoring, and environmental issues. And her research and her love is coastal and freshwater wetlands and marshes. Thank you so much for coming. Pam's a neighbor, lives very close to here.
Yeah, not too far up the road. I'm on High Tide Road, so I'm on the Little River.
Pam is also on the Conservation Trust Board still?
Correct. And I just got appointed to the Climate Task Force for Kennebunkport, so it's going to be a busy fall. Okay, I'm afraid to touch anything other than what I have to. We'll make sure this is all going to work here. Thank you, Dave. Okay. First of all, thanks so much for having me. Let's see if this, yes. I think we're good. So I've lived here in Kennebunkport for about 21 years. I know that because my son is 21 and I was pregnant with him when I moved here, and I've lived in Maine for 30-some, but I did not grow up here. I grew up in New Jersey and spent my summers at the Jersey Shore. And so to me, salt marshes were a welcome thing as my family would head for our 2 weeks of vacation down the Jersey Shore. We would cross Barnegat Bay and I would smell that delicious sulfur smell that I love so much. And I hope some of you have been able to smell that. I think it's a wonderful smell. So at any rate, I was asked to speak just for about 20 minutes. So I'm gonna go kind of quickly because I have some slides, some things I want to share with all of you, but I'm hoping to leave some time at the end for questions. However, if you have a question while I'm going, just do like my students and raise your hand, and I'd be happy to stop and answer as we go along here. And I think that's everything, so I'll go ahead and get started. So I thought, I'm sure everyone who's sitting here has some idea of what a salt marsh is because they're all around us here at the beach, but it wouldn't hurt to just put up a little definition so we're all on the same page. So salt marshes are coastal wetlands. They're flooded and drained by salt water brought in by the tides. Pretty simple. One thing that is good to know about salt marshes is that they do not have any woody plants on them. It's all what's called herbaceous vegetation. So in this picture, the trees in the background are not part of the salt marsh. If you go further south, some of you may travel to, for example, Florida in the winter. They don't really have salt marshes, they have mangroves, which are woody tree plants, wetlands. And so we have salt marshes up here. They typically have what's known as a high marsh and a low marsh zone. So in this picture, you can see this area is the low marsh, which is right next to the salt water. It gets flooded twice a day. And then the high marsh is right behind it. And that only gets flooded when it's a really big high tide. So a couple times a month, maybe. And this picture just shows that in a little different form. And you can see it's a little small on the screen, but we've got the subtitle, the mudflat, the low marsh, the high marsh, and on the right it shows you sort of what tide level helps to determine the different zones of the marsh. So there's different plants in those zones and different animals that live at those different levels. In the low marsh, it's almost all cordgrass. So you may see that's this tall grass that's down in the low marsh. High marsh, we have lots of different plants, including salt meadow hay and blackgrass. We have something called Seaside Plantain, which is actually edible. I don't know if you all know that. You can harvest and steam it. It's quite delicious. And Seaside lavender, I put as a picture just because it's beautiful. And it makes a nice dried flower too. So other plants in the high marsh zone as well, but just to kind of give you guys a little background on what they actually are. So now what I actually said I was going to talk about tonight, which is why do we value salt marshes? Why do we care about them? So I'm going to go through a few slides with you and give you my reasons why we should care about salt marshes, starting with the fact that they are beautiful. I think most people will agree that they add a lot to the aesthetic of our drive down to the beach here. And one that I'll talk about a little bit more later is their value in protecting the shoreline. So these marshes, as you can see in this picture, they are a buffer often between the upland area, where often our homes are, and the ocean. And actually some of the research that we've done has shown that salt marshes are really good at dampening wave energy. In fact, in about 21 feet we measured, 2/3 of the energy of waves will be dissipated in just 21 feet. So they're very good at taking that wave energy out and protecting the upland shoreline. They're also helpful in improving water quality. They take a lot of nutrients out of the water, nitrogen, phosphorus, things like that, as well as sediments. They trap those sediments, making the water cleaner. They're important in terms of a food web. Just a little cartoon here to show you some of the different creatures that are part of the food web of a salt marsh. Importantly, fish. So fish spend time in the salt marsh eating, but they also, small fish, juvenile fish, spend time in the marsh when they're small to escape predators. They're known as a nursery ground for young fish, and these are just a couple flounder that we caught in some of the marshes actually just up the road here a few years ago. Another important thing about salt marshes, any of you are bird watchers, is their wonderful habitat for birds. And to follow up on that last one, I know we talk about the piping plovers here a lot on the beach. Well, the salt marshes have their own little bird of interest known as the salt marsh sparrow. And the salt marsh sparrow is important because it cannot live without the salt marsh. They nest only in salt marshes. And so like our plovers, they depend, they're obligate birds in terms of the marsh. They really need that salt marsh. And so those are birds that we're keeping an eye on because unfortunately, scientists have seen them declining about 9% a year in over recent times due to the fact that our marshes are getting more flooded than they used to. And I have to put in some plants because I'm a plant person. This beautiful little pink flower is known as the salt marsh false foxglove, and it is a rare plant in the state of Maine. So salt marshes also do have some plants that are rare, not just birds, and so they're important for that too, habitat for rare plants and animals. And of course, I'm a teacher, so I have to say that salt marshes have educational value. These are my students who every other fall get to head over to Vaughn's Island. They do some work on the marshes that are owned by the Kennebunkport Conservation Trust to help the trust monitor the marshes out there. And here are some high school students from Kennebunk High School who have been studying marshes both owned by the town and by the trust in town, keeping an eye on the health of those marshes. They've been doing this work probably for the last 3 to 4 years now as part of the Gulf of Maine Field Studies class that's taught at Kennebunk High School and at the University of New England. They also do beach profiling for you guys. Okay, but now we're going to talk about something that maybe you would not know so much about why salt marshes are important. And that is that salt marshes do what's called sequestering carbon. They sequester and store carbon. And that carbon is known as blue carbon because this is done primarily in these coastal wetland habitats. So mangroves do this as well as seagrasses. And what carbon sequestration is simply is capturing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So marshes are really good at sucking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. And how do they do that? Well, you may remember from your high school biology class, something called photosynthesis, right? So they take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and they actually, with sunlight, turn that into sugars and it becomes part of the plant. It's what helps the plant to grow. It's called its biomass. And not only do they sequester that carbon, take it out of the atmosphere, they store it, which is also important. And this is a picture I took actually just down the road, not too far from here. Carbon storage is the long-term confinement of carbon in plant material or sediment. So they take the carbon and then it actually ends up, for example, in the sediment below the plants. They're storing carbon there. In the Wells Reserve, for example, down at the Marshes in the Wells Reserve, you see the carbon storage there. There are several meters deep of carbon storage. So it can really, these marshes are very good at taking carbon out of the atmosphere and storing it. And so I'm not going to show you many graphs, but this one I think is worth sharing. Salt marshes, here on this graph, it's showing how much carbon is being taken out of the atmosphere and buried, and you can see salt marshes compared to, on the left, these forest habitats, including even tropical forests, which people think, they're quite good at doing this, and then mangroves and seagrasses. So, and if you look at the y-axis here, that's a logarithmic scale. So salt marshes are do quite a bit better job than forests at taking carbon out of the atmosphere. Something to really value them for. All right, so take a breath for a minute. Now I'm going to try and explain something else that I think is important to understand with respect to this carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and sea level rise. So salt marshes are very cool in that for thousands of years, they have been able to maintain their elevation on a par with sea level. They are able to, as the sea level rises, the marshes can rise in elevation. If sea level falls, the marshes will fall. And so they've been able to maintain a really delicate balance with the sea level, which is good for all of us, again, who live behind them, because they're there to protect us from the waves of the ocean. And this diagram shows how all of this works, but I'm going to focus in on just a little piece of it here. Because the way that this happens, one way I've already talked about, is taking that carbon dioxide out of the air, putting it into the plant bodies, and then it goes down into the roots, and that helps to build up the soil. And then also, those little brown dots in the picture above are sediments that come in with the water. So when the tide comes in, or if the river water comes and crosses the marsh, there's sediment in that water, and it will slow down, the water slows down, and the sediment falls onto the surface of the marsh. So those two processes help that marsh keep up with sea level rise, which is a pretty cool thing that these marshes have been able to do for many, many years. You can actually measure this in a couple different ways, and just a couple pictures of my students doing this. A simple way is you can put clay, feldspar clay dust, on the surface of a marsh like this, and if you go back a year or two later, or depending on what your study is, whenever you want, and take a core of the sediment, I don't know if you can see this, but the one on the right you can see really clearly. There's the clay line, and then above that is all of the growth that's happened, the sediment that's fallen on top and helped that marsh to keep growing. Scientists can study this and measure this in a much more accurate and detailed way using something called sediment elevation tables. Rachel Carson, National Wildlife Refuge, and the folks there have several of these tables in marshes around in our area, and they can really get this down to the millimeter. They can see how these marshes are keeping up with sea level rise. One reason that they're doing this is for those little sparrows. They want to know if the marsh is going to continue to keep up so the sparrows will have a place to nest, but also just in general to understand the future health of our marshes. Because, as I have mentioned already, as you know, sea level is rising, and unfortunately it's rising faster than in the past. And so this little graph you can just sort of see on the right here, the lines going up, which is the future predictions of sea level, the trends in the future. This is from a document that the state of Maine has put out, the Maine Climate Council, about sort of what we should plan for in the future in terms of sea level rise. And they say that the state of Maine says we should manage for 1.5 feet of sea level rise by 2050, 4 feet by 2100, and then we're also going to have more of this nuisance flooding happening. And so I guess my point is that sea level is rising faster. We want to help marshes keep up, because those marshes keeping up is going to be good for the marshes. It's going to be good for us as well. So, are they keeping up so far? And as I've already sort of mentioned, not so well. I mean, it depends where you are, but unfortunately some marshes, we've already seen them deteriorating. This is a marsh down on Cape Cod, and as you can see here, if the marsh is flooded too much, for example, too often, and the plants die, you end up with these muddy patches, and then when you don't have the plants there, sucking that carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and building the soil anymore, then you end up with mud flats. And so that is being seen around New England now, that this is happening on many of our marshes. The other impact is the edge. The shorelines of these marshes in some places are eroding. Now, to some extent, this is natural. Marshes do erode naturally over time on the edge, but they also build back up over time. This is at the University of New England, and I don't know if you can see, but in this cove right there, there's a salt marsh that my students have been studying. It's a small marsh, but as you can see here, it's kind of drastically eroding at the edge. And so that can be a problem. If this edge is eroding back over time, you're losing your marsh. And many of the marshes in Maine are actually like this, thinner marshes, they're not huge, expansive ones. So, and I'm sure you know, just right up the road here, you know, we've got several marsh areas where there's a little river coming in or whatever, and there's just a more narrow band of marsh. So we want to really protect those. So what can we do? What can we do to protect the marshes? There's a lot of things that can be done to protect salt marshes, but I'm going to focus on a few that I'll share with you tonight. One is a really cool idea that my students and I are working on, and we're also working with the Kennebunk High School class, called Living Shorelines. And the idea of living shorelines is to protect that eroding edge of salt marshes. Living shorelines use some living material, some natural material to protect the marsh edge. So that the marsh then, in this case, this is down in New Hampshire, they created a living shoreline with some rock at the edge, and they actually filled in and planted marsh grass to try to repair that marsh so then it can go back to the job of keeping up with sea level rise. But the idea is you want to use some natural elements. This is in Maine, up near Brunswick. Here what they've done is they've put old oyster shells in some metal cages right up to the edge of the marsh. This is when it was recently installed, and they found the marsh grass now growing over this and basically colonizing the oyster shells. And also other kinds of critters will colonize it. So it's a living habitat versus putting a wall there. The other thing we can do is to protect the adjacent upland areas, so the areas behind the marshes. If you look at this picture here, you can see here's our salt marsh, and then as sea level rises, it's doing a good job, it's growing in elevation, but as you can see, it has to move landward in order to do that as well, right? Because the water is rising and the marsh will migrate landward. And if we want that to happen, we can't be putting up barriers to that, because if you put that barrier, the marsh is going to have nowhere to go, and that's called coastal squeeze. Scientists have termed that coastal squeeze, and that's something that we want to try to prevent. So living shorelines hopefully will help prevent that, but also we can plan ahead and try to find areas where our marshes can migrate and protect those. And in fact, in New Hampshire, they're even doing some work where they're cutting trees to allow more sun and allow the marshes to migrate. And in this picture, you can see that red and blue area there. You notice the dead tree in the diagram. What that's showing is the salt water is getting higher, and it's killing some of that forest vegetation. But then what that does is then it'll allow the marsh to move into that area. So that is something we can do, is we can think about where can we protect adjacent to our marshes. And the state of Maine has already begun working on this. You can go online and find, for example, I did a screenshot of one of their maps showing some of the bigger marshes around here, and they will map out for you where they think the marshes will go with a certain amount of sea level rise. So it can help people plan ahead for that marsh migration. Okay, a couple more things. Another one is restore degrading marshes. So we know some marshes have already started to suffer, as I showed you a picture of earlier. This is the marsh, sorry, this is a little hard to see, but this is the marsh behind the University of New England. You can see our soccer fields in the upper left-hand corner. That's Hills Beach Road on the right-hand side. So this is the big marsh here that's owned partly by the University of New England and part by U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Rachel Carson. There are some big open water pools forming in this marsh, so we've written a grant, which we hope will be funded, we should know any day now, to actually restore this marsh, to try and work at getting the excess water off the marsh surface so that the plants can grow and continue to do what they need to do. And there's a whole team of scientists that are involved in this up and down the New England coast, and they call themselves the SMART teams, which I think is kind of cute, Salt Marsh Adaptation and Resiliency Teams. And so these are professionals that come in, they map out the sites that they see degrading, they figure out where the water is, and they make a plan for how to restore that marsh to what it was before and to get rid of some of that excess water. So there are people out there doing all of this. But, you know, people always ask me, well, what can I do? And so I had to put this slide in here too. I mean, one thing we can all do is work at reducing our greenhouse gas emissions, right? Because no matter how you slice it, sea level rise is related to the fact that we have more greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. So whatever we can do to get at the root cause of this, I think would be really helpful. So I did want to say that. All right, so here's our beautiful salt marsh down the road here. And a little recap of what I just went through quickly. Did I stay under 20 minutes? I hope so. But I will be happy to go back to any slides or answer any questions. So I tried to make the point, salt marshes are valuable for many reasons. And although their future is uncertain, there are efforts underway to protect and to restore them. But I would be lying to you if I didn't say, I would be lying to you if I did say that everything is fine right now, because everything's not fine. I think we're looking at a future that's rather uncertain for salt marshes, and they are going to need our help. And so that's why I'm happy that you asked me to come tonight to talk to you, because as you heard, salt marshes is something that I've been working with for 20-some years, and I do care about them a lot, but I also feel like they bring a lot of value to us, and I hope that we can do our job to help them persist into the future. And so with that, I'd be happy to take any questions, and I will say that I have a ton of little citations here. If anybody's interested in more information, I'm happy to share this PowerPoint if you are interested in any of where I got my info. Lots of links in here that might be useful if anyone is interested. So, questions? Yes?
Please share the PowerPoint.
Sorry?
Please share the PowerPoint.
Oh, of course. I know, I think it's going to go on the town website somehow. You're going to have a recording of this, you said?
Yeah, the recording will be on the Beach Advisory Committee's meetings. They post them there. And if we can, maybe we can get a clip. Is it possible to get a clip without the meeting?
I'm happy to just send it to you. If you will,
Just-
if you send me an
on
email,
page.
Yeah, I have the PowerPoint,
Yeah.
or
yeah,
Pam can.
I can-
give me the
I'm happy
PowerPoint
to
post
send it
on
to
your
you.
Goose Rock
Yep.
It's a lot
page.
more powerful than Pam's comments, it's just talking to it.
Absolutely.
That's what.
right, but I think if anyone's interested in any of the links, they're right there, and it's easy to grab them right off the slide. I'm happy to do that. Yes?
How much acreage do the marshlands cover in the state of Maine?
You know, that's a very good question. I'm afraid I don't know that off the top of my head. I was just in a group that was looking at marsh acreage around New England, so I should remember this, but I don't. I know Maine, compared to other states, we don't have as many of the big expansive marshes as they do, for example, south in Massachusetts, Connecticut. What we tend to have here are the smaller marshes that line the edges of bays and rivers. But as you know, Maine's coastline is like this, and so when you add all that up, it's a pretty significant amount. Unfortunately, I don't have the number off the top of my head though for you.
Are there
Yeah.
significant marshes north of Portland? I would think that the rebound, glacial rebound, that was rising for so long, there wouldn't be many marshes up there.
Yeah, if you get further down east, there aren't as many large expansive marshes, but there are lots and lots of these smaller fringing marshes. You know, even if you go at Machias, they have a pretty good sized marsh there, but it's more along the edge of a river that's dumping out into the bay, but not the big expansive ones like you see, for example, Sparrow Marsh, right? That's one of the biggest
Right.
in Maine. They don't have those further down east, that's right.
Mark?
You indicated the importance of the marshes in regards to carbon capture,
Yes,
but Do they also produce methane? I was concerned about that on balance, so does this work?
That's a really good question. So, yeah, in the end, I showed this slide about greenhouse gases, right? And you
Can you
notice...
repeat the question?
Oh, I'm sorry for the people at home. Yes, so the question was about methane. So many wetlands, they may take in a lot of carbon dioxide, but wetlands are also known to emit methane. And methane is CH4 in this diagram here, methane gas, and it's a lot more potent than carbon dioxide in terms of trapping heat, so it's a concern. However, the good news is that tidal wetlands, where there's salt water present, do not emit as much methane as freshwater wetlands. They emit a very small amount of methane. And that has to do with the fact that the bacteria that create the methane are in competition with other bacteria that are using the sulfate from the seawater. So these bacteria are kind of battling it out, and so the methane-creating bacteria really don't do as much as they do at all in freshwater wetlands. Although recent research has shown there is some methane being produced in our marshes. People used to say really none, but now they're seeing there is some, even in salt marshes, but not as much as freshwater. So that's why there's so much interest in the blue carbon, right? Because restoring and protecting these tidal wetlands is really good in terms of climate change, and it's a much more, I think, of a win even than with the freshwater wetlands. Good question.
Pam, I've seen the Rachel Carson people off of Dyke Road over
Yep.
the years measuring. I don't see them at the other end at Little River because I guess they may not own that land, sort of in the middle of the river. But I'm wondering if you know how the Dyke Road area, both sides, is doing, or how, is it on the Rachel Carson website? Do they?
Yeah, that's a good question. You know, just myself from riding my bike back and forth up and down that road all the time, you know, the side on the left is pretty wet as you head to the beach. It looks a little concerning to me. The side on the right looks a lot better, just as from my eyeballing it. I don't know if Rachel Carson has done any actual measurements in that area, but that's a good question, and I can certainly ask my colleague who I'm working with, because I know they're all throughout here. They work down on the marshes, sort of on the other side. They have those sediment elevation tables out there and several sample points in the marshes, but I'm not sure about that one. I don't think so.
Yeah, we had a speaker years and years ago, and I think they called it, on the left side going to the beach, they called it a ghost forest. Is that the right word?
Oh, really? A ghost forest?
Marsh, ghost forest, yeah.
Because there's so many dead trees in there because of the water level.
Rising up.
It only gets salt at king time. It's the only time. And to the right, that's all active. That's every time.
Right.
Every time. And every full moon will flood it. But the left side, very seldom.
So that's the other thing in terms of, there's many impacts to our marshes, but one of the big ones over the years has been cutting them off from salt water.
Right.
So you got to keep that salt water flowing in and out in order for the marsh to be healthy. And so, for example, down in Biddeford Pool, I noticed a few years back, they increased the size of a culvert going under the road there so that the marsh would be able to get the amount of salt water that it really needed. So there's also a lot of work being done in that department, just trying to restore marshes by making sure they have the salt water that they need and not pinching them off from the tide. Yeah. Good point. Other questions just in general about salt marshes or anything else? And I know some of you have probably been watching the marshes down here for many years and may have seen changes or things that I'm not aware of. And I'd love to hear if you have any perspectives on the local marshes to share. John?
What effect does Dyke Road have on the marshes?
It cuts it off.
Yeah. Yeah, and the diking overall, Canada's a whole nother story. They have huge dikes in Canada that have cut off the marshes. So yes, and that's typically what happens. And that, does Dyke Road have any kind of a culvert going under? I think it does, right?
But it's small.
But it's small.
When I was growing up, it was a heck of a lot smaller than it is now.
And now they've expanded
It's
it
a little bit
somewhat.
larger, but I wonder if doubling
interesting to look at that and look at the hydrology.
Yeah,
and
when the
see
road,
how
I mean,
much
that
it's
road is going to
flushing.
have to be raised at some point,
Yeah.
so,
That
because
would be
it
good for
floods
the
so
marsh.
often, so that would be the time. It's in the comprehensive plan
Oh, good.
to do that, to help that.
Through there too, it's a real pinch point.
Yeah, I know, I can imagine. It's right on level with the marsh
That
there.
bad area, quote that area on the left-hand side as you come in, it looks like a salt pan almost. It doesn't get much water in it. And there is a drain there, that drains that comes under the road. You can see it if you watch it. And then you can see the remains of the old dike there that goes partly right along the edge of the road and then goes out into the marsh. You can see the edges of it. And there's an interesting thing happening in that marsh. If you're coming in and you look off on the way, you get closer in by the, I guess, the first house of that group that sits on the right-hand side, not the one way up, but once you go down where the old hill used to be. There's a piece of the marsh that's eroding. And 2 years ago, there's a little piece that didn't have any grass on it. And now it's a wedge. And it looks like there's going to be stream capture between those two.
We're gonna get an oxbow.
Yep, there's going to be an oxbow up there.
You should be photographing that over time. That would be very cool. Yeah, because the other thing that happens too, I'm thinking, when you have something like a road cut off the marsh, the other thing it does is it doesn't just cut off the salt water coming in and out and flushing out the marsh, but it also, when there's rain, a rain event,
Right.
all that fresh water gets trapped. And that's why you're probably seeing it so wet over there. You might think, well, why is it so wet if the tide's not coming in and out? It has a hard time draining, so that's another issue. It's a little tricky.
And for the trivia, you're talking about those dikes, and from my understanding, many of those dikes were created actually in not pre-industrial time, but like in the late 19th century, before oil was a problem of today, because this is where people could produce hay.
Exactly.
At the time, paper of the day was hay, if you think about it.
Right, and many of the dikes, so it could have been for a road, but more often it's just what you said. And we found actually in New England recently, people have noticed not just large dikes, but small berms, might only be this big, throughout the marshes that were built for that exact reason, to try to keep the salt water out so that the hay would grow better, and then they could also harvest it for the animals. Because if you look at old maps, like way old maps, and you look at the salt marsh, you'll see that the salt marsh was cut into plots that were owned by people that lived up in the forest. Because it's a heck of a lot easier if you moved here to get hay for your animals on the marsh than to cut down all the trees and plant hay on your property.
Move those rocks, that was the problem.
And move those rocks, right, John? So yes, that's a good point, that, historically, people didn't realize that they were, causing trouble with the marsh. They were just trying to find a place to raise their crops or to have more hay for their animals. And that was one of the big reasons why they built these little dikes of different sizes. As I said, in Canada, some of them are quite large. But here they're small, but they still, unfortunately, have had a negative impact over time. But scientists are now very aware of this and have been mapping them. And as I said, they can work at rerouting the water channels, growing back vegetation in certain areas. They even have done projects where they spray sediment slurry over the surface of the marsh to try to raise the elevation. So there's all kinds of cool stuff going on right now. Anything else?
I have one.
Yeah, sure.
With the prediction of a 1.5 foot sea rise over time, with the saltwater marsh behind Goose Rocks off of Dike Road, will that survive? Because I ask because it floods much more frequently now than it ever did before.
You know what, the answer to that is it depends. I mean, I think it really does depend. We have to see, again, if the marsh is able to keep flourishing and the plants grow and produce enough biomass to put into the soils. But, it's not looking super optimistic. It's possible, but it may need, as I said, it may need some help.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. The problem is not that the sea level is rising. The problem is the rate.
Right.
It's rising faster than the marshes can keep up. That's the concern. Yeah. But I don't want to end on a downer. So who has another question about the marshes that's a more, any critter questions or plant questions?
Well, I know you don't want to end on a downer, but as a scientist, and I think it would be important to hear it sometime, that a lot of people don't realize that 2 degrees doesn't seem like a big deal, because we're talking about a double integration. It's 2 degrees over time and everywhere in the world. So it's actually 2 degrees is only measuring the amount of energy that we have taken on, of solar energy that we have taken in addition to that. And to put things in perspective, we started being sedimentary, and creating agriculture and stuff like that only 10,000 years ago. And the reason why is because 10,000 was the end of the last glaciation period, So essentially around here, we were definitely under a mile high, maybe a bit higher going up in Canada, of ice. And all that ice, the same thing over Northern Europe, was taken obviously from the water from the ocean, and the ocean was 152 meters below on average. But the point I'm making, then, and this cycle is only due to astronomic elements, there's just the way that the Earth gets oriented and many other things, but let's not get into detail of that. And slowly it started reheating, but it took 5,000 years to go up by only 5 degrees, 4 to 5 degrees, over 5,000 years. Now, we're in the process, we're signed in for 2 degrees, okay? When people are telling you that they're going to be okay with 1.5 degrees, this is not happening. We're definitely signing for at least 2, for various reasons that we could take a long time to explain. And the point I'm making is, we're doing a very novel experience, We had the Earth do an experiment for us, 10,000 years ago, of going, or I think 20,000 years ago, starting to go warmer, and then over 5,000 years giving it 5 degrees, and now we're doing 2 degrees in about 100 years. Okay, so the scientists, we cannot say what's going to happen. People say, "Oh, are the marshes going to survive? Not survive? Is it going to be a foot and a half or 2 feet?" A lot of things, get prepared for a lot of surprises, and I don't mean you don't want to handle the downer, so we're going to find something nicer to say at the end. But I think it's important that people would get that in the back of their mind. I think it's not said enough that this is not just some horror stories told by some kind of crazy people. Please do things like reading the IPCC, for example, and in the group 1 and 2, and group 3, they're crazy. But the group 1 and 2 of IPCC, especially group 2, will, how would I say that, give you, if you read the summary for policymakers, exactly, it's relatively short and well detailed, and it will give you an idea of what there is a consensus of the scientific community about those problems.
Yeah, I think you make a good point too. Again, it's the rate that we're, so these marshes did actually start forming thousands of years ago, and they've been slowly, accumulating all this time. Like I said, at the Wells Reserve, they've actually measured the age of the marshes and calculated how much the sediments have accumulated over those thousands and thousands of years. But when the Industrial Revolution occurred, and that wasn't that long ago, that was in the 1800s, and so in a very short span of time, we're changing the temperature a lot. I think that's the point. And so, yes, I don't know if you all have grandkids, I have kids, and we have to think ahead a little bit. And if we care about Goose Rock's Beach and the marshes in the future, it is something to take seriously. So you're right, we shouldn't make light of it, and I certainly wasn't trying to do that, but it's a serious subject. But I guess I'd also say that we are also blessed in this area with beautiful and magnificent nature all around us, and so I know I go there a lot for my strength and inspiration, and I hope that you all can do that as well, and just be grateful that we have this and we can enjoy it now, but also get involved in fight for your grandchildren and your children, I'd say. How's that?
Thank you. And you were looking for positive things. You showed them the students, for example, which are studying about that, and that's a new generation. And I
Yes.
think there's a lot more consciousness about what is going on from there, and that's our beacon of hope.
Right, but then we can't always leave it all up to the young folks. We
yeah.
gotta do our part, right? Just saying.
Thank you so much, Pam.
Thanks for
We
having me.
really appreciate your time. Great. If folks could help put the chairs over there, that would be great. Someone could hit the lights back on so we don't trip. We'll see you next month.